He buried his wife and son 10 years ago. Then a widow with copper hair made his dead heart beat again. Subscribe to Wild Sky Stories' new emotional tales every day. The winter of 1878 had been the cruelest Silas Harding ever remembered, not because of the snow that buried the Montana territory waist deep, but because that was the year he lowered 2 pine boxes into the frozen ground behind his ranch house. His wife Margaret and their infant son Thomas, taken by fever within 3 days of each other. Silas had stood at those graves until the numbness in his bones matched the numbness in his soul, and something inside him simply stopped feeling. 10 years passed like shadows across a wall, present but somehow unreal. Silas worked his cattle, mended his fences, and spoke to his horses more than he spoke to any living person. The townspeople of Bitter Creek called him the Ghost Rancher, and they weren't entirely wrong. He was 42 years old, but his eyes belonged to a much older man, gray and distant as mountain storms. The first day of September brought a stagecoach rolling into Bitter Creek, carrying dust and new beginnings. Silas happened to be in town that morning, purchasing supplies at Henderson's general store when the commotion started. Folks gathered around the stage, curious about the woman stepping down with a young boy clutching her hand. Silas didn't mean to look. Looking meant acknowledging, and acknowledging meant caring, and caring meant eventually losing. But something made him glance toward the street, and there she was. She had auburn hair that caught the sunlight like autumn leaves, and eyes the color of strong coffee. She wasn't young, maybe 35, with lines around her mouth that spoke of both laughter and sorrow. The boy beside her couldn't have been more than 7, with the same copper hair and a face full of freckles. They stood in the dusty street, looking lost and brave all at once. "That'll be the new school teacher," old Henderson said from behind his counter. "Josephine Brennan, widow from back east. Town council hired her after Miss Patterson got married and moved to California." Silas grunted, pretending disinterest, but his eyes kept drifting to the window. He watched as the woman squared her shoulders, lifted her chin, and marched toward the boarding house with her son trotting beside her. There was courage in her posture, the kind that comes from having nothing left to lose. 3 weeks went by before their paths crossed properly. Silas was loading lumber into his wagon when the Brennan boy came running around the corner, chased by 3 larger boys throwing rocks. One stone caught the child on the shoulder, and he stumbled, falling hard into the dirt. Something woke inside Silas, something he'd thought long dead. He stepped into the street, and the 3 bullies froze at the sight of him. The Ghost Rancher, 6 feet of weathered muscle and eyes like winter ice. "Run along," Silas said, his voice rough from disuse. The boys scattered like startled quail. Silas looked down at the fallen child. Blood trickled from a scraped knee, and tears streaked paths through the dust on his cheeks. But the boy wasn't crying out. He was biting his lip, trying to be brave. "You hurt bad?" Silas asked. The boy shook his head, pushing himself up. "No, sir. I'm okay. Thank you, sir." Before Silas could respond, Josephine Brennan came rushing around the corner, skirts gathered in her hands, fear written across her face. When she saw her son standing with Silas, she stopped short, breathing hard. "Eli!" She ran to the boy, kneeling in the dirt, checking him over with trembling hands. "What happened? Are you hurt?" "Some boys were chasing me, Mama, but this man made them stop." Josephine looked up at Silas, and for a moment neither spoke. Up close he could see the gold flecks in her brown eyes, could see the grateful tears threatening to spill over. "Thank you," she whispered. "I don't know what I would have done if—" "Wasn't nothing," Silas said, already stepping back. "Boy's tough, he'll be fine." He turned and walked to his wagon, ignoring the strange tightness in his chest. He didn't look back as he drove out of town, but he thought about those brown eyes the entire ride home. October painted the mountains in shades of gold and crimson. Silas found himself coming to town more often than necessary, always with a reasonable excuse. More grain, another tool, coffee he didn't really need. And somehow, he always managed to pass the little schoolhouse where Josephine Brennan taught letters and numbers to the children of Bitter Creek. One particularly cold morning, he saw her struggling with an armload of firewood behind the schoolhouse. The wood was stacked poorly, and the wind was bitter, and she wore a coat too thin for Montana weather. Silas tied his horse to the post and crossed the frozen ground before he could talk himself out of it. "Let me help with that," he said, taking the logs from her arms. She startled, not having heard his approach. "Mr. Harding, I didn't expect. That is, thank you. You need a proper woodpile," he said, stacking the logs by the back door. "This one's a mess. Wind and rain get in, ruins the wood. I know. I've been meaning to fix it, but there aren't enough hours in the day." She smiled tiredly. "Back in Philadelphia, we had coal delivery. I'm still learning how things work out here." Silas looked at the tumble-down woodpile, then at her thin coat, then at the schoolhouse with its drafty windows. Without quite deciding to, he said, "I'll come by Saturday, fix that pile proper. Check your windows, too." The gratitude in her face made him uncomfortable. "Mr. Harding, I couldn't possibly—" "No trouble," he said gruffly. "Town needs its school teacher warm." He left before she could thank him again, before he could examine too closely why he'd offered, before the warmth spreading through his chest could take root. Saturday came, and Silas arrived at dawn with tools and lumber. Josephine invited him inside for coffee first, and he found himself sitting in her small kitchen while young Eli peppered him with questions about horses and cattle, and whether he'd ever seen a real outlaw. The boy was starved for a man's attention. Silas could see that plain as day. Josephine watched them talk, a complicated expression on her face. "His father died when he was 3, she said quietly when Eli ran off to get his wooden horse to show Silas. "He doesn't remember him. Sometimes I think that's a mercy. Sometimes I think it's the saddest thing in the world." Silas nodded slowly. "My boy would have been 12 this year. If he'd lived." The words came out before he could stop them, the first time he'd spoken of Thomas to anyone in years. Josephine's eyes filled with understanding, the kind that comes only from walking through the same fire. "I'm so sorry," she said. "His mother too," Silas continued, unable to stop now. "Both of them, same week. Fever took them." Josephine reached across the table and laid her hand over his. Her fingers were warm and small against his rough skin. She didn't speak, didn't offer empty platitudes. She simply held his hand and let him know he wasn't alone. They stayed like that until Eli came bounding back with his toy horse, and then the moment passed. But something had shifted between them, some wall had crumbled, and both of them knew it. Through the long winter months, Silas became a regular presence at the burr. Enin home. He fixed what needed fixing, taught Eli to ride on his gentlest mare, and stayed for supper more nights than he ate alone. The townspeople noticed and talked, as townspeople do, but Silas found he didn't care what they said. Josephine told him about her husband William, a kind man who'd worked himself to death in a factory trying to provide for his family. She talked about leaving Philadelphia after he died, taking the teaching position in Montana because she needed a fresh start, a place where she and Eli could build something new. "I was so scared when I stepped off that stage," she admitted one evening sitting by her fire while Eli slept in the next room. "I'd never been west of Pittsburgh. Everyone warned me I was making a terrible mistake, coming to this wild country with a small child." "Were they right?" Silas asked. She looked at him, firelight dancing in her eyes. "No, they were wonderfully, blessedly wrong." The first time Silas kissed her was on Christmas Eve. Snow was falling softly outside, and Eli had finally gone to sleep after hours of excitement over the holiday. They stood in her kitchen, and Josephine was laughing at something he'd said. Her whole face lit up with joy, and Silas simply couldn't help himself. The kiss was gentle, almost reverent, 10 years of loneliness meeting hope for the first time. When they pulled apart, Josephine had tears on her cheeks. "I never thought I'd feel this way again," she whispered. "Neither did I, Sil." As said, and he realized he was crying too, for the first time since he'd buried his wife and son. "I buried my heart out behind my house, Josephine. I never expected anyone to find it." "I didn't find it," she said, touching his face. "You gave it to me." Spring came early that year, as if the world itself was blessing their new beginning. Silas asked Josephine to marry him on an April morning when wildflowers were blooming across the meadows and the mountains wore caps of melting snow. He got down on one knee in the schoolyard in front of all the children, including Eli, who jumped up and down shouting, "Say yes, Mama, say yes." Josephine said yes through laughter and tears, and the children cheered, and somewhere in the blue Montana sky, Silas liked to think Margaret was smiling too, happy that he'd finally found his way back to the living. The wedding was simple, held in the little church with most of the town in attendance. Josephine wore a blue dress that matched the spring sky, and Silas wore a suit he'd had to buy special because nothing he owned was fit for such an occasion. When the preacher pronounced them husband and wife, Eli tugged at Silas's sleeve. "Does this mean I can call you Pa now?" the boy asked. Silas lifted Eli into his arms, holding the child against his chest. "I'd be honored if you would." Josephine moved out to the ranch with Eli, and the house that had been silent for a decade suddenly filled with noise and life and love. Silas built a row onto the back for Eli, with a window facing the mountains. He put in a bigger kitchen for Josephine, who loved to cook and fill the house with warm, delicious smells. The first time he took his new wife out to the old graves, his heart pounded with anxiety. But Josephine knelt in the grass, placed wildflowers on the headstones, and spoke to Margaret and Thomas as if they were old friends. "Thank you for loving him," she said softly. "Thank you for shaping him into the man I fell in love with. I promise to take good care of him." Silas wept openly, standing in the place where he'd once thought he'd died right alongside his first family. Josephine rose and wrapped her arms around him, holding him as he released years of grief. "They're part of our family now," she said, "all of our loved ones who've passed. William and Margaret and little Thomas. They're all ours." That evening they sat on the porch watching the sun set behind the mountains, Eli asleep inside after a long day of exploring his new home. Josephine leaned against Silas's shoulder, and he breathed in the scent of her hair. "I used to think I'd never feel warm again," he said, "after I lost them, like winter had moved inside me and taken up permanent residence." "And now?" Josephine asked. "Now I feel like I've been given a second chance I never deserved. You and Eli, you brought summer back to me." She tilted her face up to kiss his weathered cheek. "You brought something back to us too, you know. Eli needed a father. I needed a partner. We needed someone to make us a real family again. We found each other," Silas said. "Against all odds, across all those miles, we found each other." Josephine continued teaching at the school, while Eli grew strong and tall on the ranch, learning the cattle trade from the man he proudly called Pa. Years passed, good years filled with hard work and simple pleasures, and a love that grew deeper with each passing season. On their 5th anniversary, Silas took Josephine up to his favorite spot in the mountains, a ridge where you could see for miles in every direction. They sat on a flat rock, older now but still holding hands like newlyweds. "I want you to know something," Silas said, his voice thick with emotion. "When you walked into my life, I was already dead. Just a ghost going through the motions. You resurrected me, Josephine. You gave me reason to breathe again." She leaned her head against his shoulder, silver now appearing in her auburn hair. "And you gave me something I thought was gone forever, a true partner. A father for my son, a love I never expected to find. I thought my story was over," Silas continued. "I thought the best parts were behind me, but they weren't. The best parts were ahead waiting for me. I just had to survive long enough to reach them. That's what life is, isn't it?" Josephine said softly, surviving the dark times until we reached the light again. Below them, the ranch spread out like a painting. The cattle dotting the green pastures, the house with its new additions standing proud against the landscape. Eli was down there somewhere, probably in the barn with his favorite horse, their life, their family, their second chance. "I love you, Josephine Harding," Silas said, the words still foreign on his tongue even after 5 years, still precious every time he spoke them. "I love you too, Silas," she replied, "until the mountains crumble and the rivers run dry." He kissed her there on the mountain ridge, with the wind whispering through the pines and the sun warming their faces. A man who'd buried his heart long ago, and the woman who'd walked into his life and helped him find it again. Some people only get one love story. Silas Harding had been blessed with 2, and as he held his wife in his arms, watching their worlds spread out below them, he finally understood that hearts are not buried forever. They're simply waiting, patient as seeds in winter ground, for the right person to come along and bring them back to life.